Hello, and welcome to video number 9 in a series on leftism and climate change. My name is Max Reynolds, and I'm the author of The Revolutionary Renaissance, a study on the dialectical evolution of totalitarian thought. You can find more of my work at my website maxoreynolds.com or up on my Twitter posts and YouTube channels. In the last lecture, we examined a number of documents, the Stockholm 1972 one, the Agenda 21, and a number of different conventions, and the very broad issues that arise with the language in those documents, and then how they've been signed up to by nations, and then of course the essentially gifting oneself of one powers that nations are seeking to do through the mediator of the United Nations. Now, it was quite clear that a core and important theses which underpin both Stockholm 1972 and many of the conventions, yes, they do come in response to, of course, scientific information on, for example, CFC depletion of the ozone layer. However, in parallel to the scientific aspect, and there of course can be man-made impact on the environment, is the sideways or the moral system which is interfacing with this new information which science gives us. And of course, the moral principles and framework which we use in making our decisions will, when certain information comes in, potentially result in very different outcomes. And of course, if we know that there's a very the ends justify the means, as there is in the Marxist doctrines, then this information can be used in order to achieve a certain end. Of course, that would be the further totalization of all of humanity under this monadological system. Now, in some of my other videos recently, I've been exploring how Marxism uses anti-Christianity to negate Christianity and to then move into a pantheist endpoint. That pantheist endpoint, of course, we will know as the species being or humanity nature. So you've got the dual aspect, which is the conscious substance that is human, and then you've got unconscious substance, which is nature or being. And these two mated together make up the singular monad. Now, a number of doctrines and philosophers throughout the 20th and 21st century have really been working. Well, initially there was a lot of development on the species side, the humanity side. So this is maintaining the same definition of human and trying to move things forward. And then there's also been a growing environmentalist aspect, essentially from the 60s forward. So that's the being aspect being modified. But then with post-structuralism, which we saw with Aaron Guerra and so on, we then see that there's now a further development of the human aspect to post-humanity. And so these things move not in tandem, but sequentially, but in relation to one another. And so what we're going to explore now is how a number of these ideas are complemented by a new system which is being developed, which will be global citizenship. In writing my own book, I read a number of the works of a man named Paulo Freire, and he is important for a number of reasons. One, because of his role in liberatory theology and developing the dialectical materialist methodology in that realm. Importantly, that means the parasitization of Christianity and it's being tied into dialectical materialism. So somewhere in Paulo Freire's system, you're going to see that there's a kind of anti-Christianity, which is used to merge with Christianity, therefore destroying both of them, but which moves into a utopian endpoint. So it's all along essentially the exact same movement and framework as Marx's original intent, but the form it takes is different because we've got a lot of work which has happened since Marx, which has changed the entire conceptual framework which is being used in this dialectical movement forward. And the reason I pick up on Paulo Freire is because when I read a document which was all about the learning objectives of global citizenship, he was cited explicitly. And there are other citations which are very important later on as well, which are related to the dialectical syntheses of different religions in relation to global citizenship, identity, and morality. So it's a convergence of different religious systems by dialectical materialists in order to and to tie it into the already academically formulated moral system of global citizenship, which includes social justice, particularly ecological justice. Paulo Freire and pedagogy. As alluded to, Paulo Freire is one of the key figures, and you see him working in relation to a subject area called liberatory theology, which was a specific political, worldly manifestation in the context and in relation to Christianity in South America. However, it's very important to say that it is not Christian. It's fundamentally a form of heresy. It moves the morals and teachings of Christ to the person, rather than the person moving to the morals and teachings of Christ. That inversion is very important, because that's the difference between correctly following the religion and it versus establishing a worldly religion which is oriented around your own politics and arbitrary morals. Okay, so one of the key things in the dialectical materialism is to unite different opposites, theses, antitheses. So here we've got Christianity and neo-marxism being united together, and it's fundamentally a Gramscian project. If you go back and read Gramsci, what's very clear is that education basically achieves pride of place in Gramsci's thought. If you read Marx's thesis on Feuerbach, I think it's the fourth one, the status of the world is changed first by educating people. And it's that point that Gramsci really hammers home on. And so he attacks things like common sense, he attacks Catholicism explicitly. All of these are different things which either maintain people with a certain moral system or with a certain ability to apprehend reality. Of course, you need to negate both of those if you're going to move people off into the dialectical materialist fantasy world. So Gramsci's theses really hit on expanding the proletariat to different groups. So now it's called the subaltern. You've got the education system, the content which is transferred, the kinds of people which are teachers. These are all influenced. You've got more psychology coming in because of the effect of Nietzsche and then psychoanalysis. And so there's the beginnings of the Frankfurt School development of a dialectical synthesis between neo-Marxism and psychoanalysis. Well, that actually has its roots in Gramsci. But it's really, Freire's work is a continuation of Gramsci because he emphasizes education and certain methodology in coming to knowledge more prominently than many other theoreticians. Freire is probably one of the most important Marxist theoreticians in the 21st century. Okay, so one of the things about Freire is that he, in spite of the great leap forward and obviously all of the murdering and death and starvation, he still praises Mao. And the important connection between Mao and Gramsci is that what Gramsci was putting forward as his thesis, as his theory, Mao can be seen as having put into practice. And if you look at the early writings of Mao, there is quite a sudden turn around the time that Gramsci was doing his prison notebooks and that they were being smuggled out. The cultural level starts to enter the the conceptual framework of the Marxists. You start to have ideas of cultural advancement, cultural level, a certain cultural education which needs to take place to usurp the cultural hegemony of the Kuomintang. So you got this all being developed. And then later on, we've obviously got the Frankfurt School, so they have critical theory, and that's the trying to negate the existing society or the kinds of ideas which are communicated, the morals and so on and so forth. And then lastly, of course, we've got Jean-Paul Sartre as a key influencer of Freire. And so this is the idea that all of different aspects of life have a praxeological element, but praxes can become trapped off in eddies, so you need to unify people in orientation towards the right goal. And the key goal, again, for Freire is that he's a utopian, so it's back towards the known end. So if you've got a known end in Marx of communism, and then socialism and that development, here in Freire you've got the same. but it's got explicit utopian aspect. Okay, so the key criticism that Freire levels at prior dialectical materialists is that they developed their systems or implemented their ideas whilst being in a state of contradiction. And of course, contradiction in the dialectical materialist world is something equivalent to sin. It's something which division is the fundamental issue of reality. It's the thing which is one of the things which is evil, and that we need to free ourselves from. So there's an issue over the revolutionary intellectual leaders and the people who follow them, and the idea is to collapse the distinction between the two. You already get that in Gramsci, where he's addressing the schools and the idea that all people must be revolutionary intellectuals. So what Gramsci's saying is that all people have to have access to the concepts, the methodology, and so on and so forth. That is put into effect most effectively by Freire. So there's an issue here about embodying the dialectic correctly, and if it's just given from teacher to student, then there's still a contradiction maintained which disrupts the apparent advancement. And that's reflected as a contradiction in praxis. So that's where you have a term called non-solidarity. The real thing that we want to establish is solidarity. But all of these issues, like we've explored in some of my other videos, they begin in the family and education system. So you need to take over the education system, put ideas into people, so that when people have children, they'll already be implanted with dialectical ideas, which are further pushed through the education system, and then society spirals off into its dialectical nightmare. So the problem that Freire accuses the existing education system of is that it domesticates people. And so what they do is they reproduce the same model of education, the same kind of content, the same morals, ideas, behaviours and institutions. And living in this domesticated existence, they're essentially less than human. Domestication has a relation with Sartre's idea of the interiorization of the oppressor. So the oppressor exists, has their governing ideology, but you've got the psychology of the person, the way that they behave, and what's passed down and instilled within all people is the governing ideas and the praxis of the oppressors. And so the idea is that you've got this oppressed person who's essentially been impregnated to express themselves as what is not themselves. It's a funny way of explaining things, but once you kind of get into this logic, it should make sense. It's basically being a false version of yourself because someone else has imposed it on you. And so you need to free yourself of this imposition through the revolutionary raising of consciousness and then putting into effect the revolutionary practice. And then you'll partially have freed yourself. You'll start to free the rest of the world. And then you can move to increasing dialectical syntheses of dialectical freedom. Okay, so domestication, this interiorization of the oppressor, serves to perpetuate capitalism. And of course, once we go to perpetuating capitalism, that's the system of private property, associated therefore with labour, fetishism, so on and so forth. Now, Freire describes neoliberalism as a scourge, and that he has no sense of impartiality. He wants to eliminate it. And so one of the key things for him to raise is this thing called Conscientization. And this idea is an extension of consciousness raising, but which now includes the various theses of people like Gramsci, Sartre, and certainly by the time of Freire's later writings, you have an integration which is explicit of post-structuralism into Freire's system. So you can see one of the interesting things if you're reading a dialectical author is to take books from different points in their life. And what you'll see is that at the start there'll be some ideas, and then at a later point there might be a dialectical integration of a new movement. You get some of that. For example, Aaron Gare's Environmentalism, an earlier environmentalism would have been probably quite crude, but once you have post-structuralism, you have a breaking apart of the status quo, a changing of the form of humanity and nature, but then after that you've got the requirement to come to a new dialectical synthesis. So the movements are bolted in, they break things apart, they reintegrate things. They go in this cadence. Now, the Conscientiousatschau has it's rooted explicitly in dialectical reason and historicism, and this is the advancement of the educational thesis of Gramsci. So the person needs to adopt a few key concepts. Of course, they're being domesticated, they're being destroyed, and that this prevents them from being fully human. So first you must know yourself as a victim who has been oppressed down to the level of the form of logic, the knowledge you use, the morals that you have been taught, what you deem to be right and wrong, so what is right and wrong, and so on and so forth. So the idea is that you've been so horrendously oppressed that now you have to essentially throw off reality. And the new form of consciousness raising, Conscientiousatschau, is inclusive of cultural, linguistic, and different knowledge aspects. So it does have more to draw upon than, for example, orthodox Marxism, because it's recognizing that knowledge can be a barrier which affects people's consciousness and judgment, and which impedes their ability to become a dialectical materialist. Now, of course, if you can take over the body of knowledge fundamentally by taking over the educational institution, then you can undermine this by making people more subjective, subject to emotion, and less versed in scientific methods and so on and so forth. So people become far more easily moved. And that's necessary if you're going to induce people into this religion of pathos. Okay, so you can take something which is cultural, or even the language that people use, or the existing system of knowledge, and you can say that these are being formulated by oppressors in order to keep you in your present position. Look at how this affects the way you behave. What you need to do is to then critique how something, for example, like a piece of knowledge, such as the combustion engine, was something designed by oppressors in order to exploit people's labor by taking them away from their families or whatever it happens to be, but also exhibiting the capitalists and private property owners' inherent conflict with nature, which is basically one of the fundamentals of everything in the Marxist technology framework. Whether it's original Marx or later Marxists, it's the opposition, it's the seeing something as distinct from yourself, which leads to the exploitation, and then and of course here that exploitation would be the rapacious use of nature, and which from the perspective of the Marxist becomes a anti-human system. Of course, the anti-human system is given a big caveat, given that Marx requires the murder of people openly in order to move from Christianity through anti-Christianity to his pantheist species being endpoint. So you've got human sacrifice in order to bring about a new deified reality of which you would be a part. So self-deification and human sacrifice in order to self-deify. Okay, that was a bit of a digression. So yeah, issues can be overturned through cultural action, which critiques. The idea is to take existing ideas and you attack them, you destroy them, you dialectically reform them if possible. And by doing so, you reform the culture, the language, and the knowledge which are in people's consciousness. And then you fundamentally create new people, change their nature, and get them to behave differently. Of course, the existing culture, language, and knowledge, they are limit situations. So you want to always try and push things to find the point which is getting the most resistance, and then you expose all of the power relations which are oriented around that and the knowledge and language required, and then all of that needs to be reformed in order to serve the revolutionary goal. As I said, the untested feasibility is the utopia, so you need to try and keep getting things back to the point where people are willing to test utopia. Of course, we know that once people attempt to test utopia on the promise that perfection can be obtained, any price is worth paying. That's where the human sacrifice and pantheist element comes back in. Okay, so the solution which Freire puts forward to the blight of our present day and system is liberatory pedagogy. So you're going to free the you're going to free all of the existing relationships and ways in which education takes place from their current state of being, and to reform them in order that they will realize the ends of the revolutionary goal. So here you have a thesis, antithesis, synthesis movement being applied to the student and the teacher. So you actually collapse them as thesis and antithesis, so it's student-teacher. And the idea is there that the relationship is inherently inverting one time and another. So the thing which gets the students to respond, so a teacher will say something, and it might be something that was, culturally relevant, or something which is cool, something that the kids engage with and go, wow. And then what you then attempt to do is to tap into that and use that, and then integrate that into that emotion of awe and joy towards the end goal. So that would be the utopian aspect. And then taking the things which have strong negative reaction to, and then associating them with the present and the system of morals and knowledge and so on and so forth, which underpin that. So you're trying to deliberately split people's emotional reactions in relation to the specific goal that's attempting to be obtained. Okay, one of the key things, of course, in this is if you're going to have a student-teacher where the relationship between the two inverts, so the children are seen as teaching the teacher what they're going to respond to, and then the teacher then uses this to feed dialectical ideas and concepts to the child, and then the child needs to develop those in collective collaboration with the other children around them and with the teacher. And so the idea here is that you're trying to have a collapse of all of the different contradictions at the different levels, and that there's fundamentally an experience of partaking in a collective apprehension of the world, which is in reflection of a more ideal society, which can then be reflected in consciousness, put into a theoretical map which further helps the understanding of reality, which has a linguistic aspect to it, obviously, so that you could partake in the dialectical methodology to begin with, but has the influence of post-Derrida reforming language itself, or if you were Foucauldian, reforming the discourses. So you have a reformation of theory, you have a reformation of linguistic and discursive aspects. These in turn would reflect the way that you speak and you conduct yourself, and then you go through the continuing dialectical sequences of the reformation of knowledge democratically. And the objects of knowledge which come in are basically observances of events in the wider world. So it could be something like, you'd go to, school, and there'd be a lesson, and it would be talking about money, and it would be saying, there's a Pareto distribution. And the Pareto distribution, from a Marxist perspective, would probably not be seen as a natural outcome of nature. It would probably be seen as the outcome of a deliberate imposition of the ideology of private ownership and everything associated therewith. So that's just a kind of like an off-the-cuff example. And then the task, if you were in a Freirean classroom, would be to try and envision the future where you would have the apparent morals and social organization and perfectly organized system as if it was a computer that you can just type numbers in and you can get the flat line that you want, so that there's no Pareto distribution in terms of wealth and property. So that would be an example, but the point is it has to happen democratically, so everyone gets to chip in with their ideas. And fundamentally, if you're in school and you're young, then all you know is things that you picked up from culture, things you picked up from your parents, things you picked up in school. But what you lack completely is, wisdom and experience in the world. So you can go from, kind of principles, which you can be taught and repeat. But the problem is there's no kind of experience there against which to properly set that, particularly readings of history. So what you probably won't get is, or you would get a reading of history, but through the historicist lens, it would be dialectically interpreted as being a history contrived in order to maintain people in their state of oppression, which in turn needs to be thrown off. And the truth, which would be the inversion of history as we know it, would be the one that would need to be realized, and so on and so forth. All very straightforward once you understand the methodology. And one of the key one of the key things which is driving the need for the democratic creation of knowledge, which will orient people towards the realization of the end goal of utopia, is that there needs to be a solidarity in theory and practice. So you have solidarity in the collective aspect. That's more commonly called democracy. But then you have, but it's got to be materialist. So there's different levels at which these words have meaning. So solidarity is solid as in, something solid, but also solidarity in taking an idea from theory, putting it into practice and making it real in the world. Remember that Marx says that, it's the man has to demonstrate the force of his thinking, or the power of his thought in the world. So really what Freire is doing is he's using a Gnostic process of knowledge creation, which he calls research. This whole process of coming to taking different cultural contents. That guy down there is poor. He is poor for a reason. Someone made him poor. Blah, 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 blah. Dialectical syntheses. Private property bad. Got to have a revolution. Yada, yada, yada. Utopia. And then just move off into the mess. So Freire explicitly calls it a system of gnoseological knowing. So the statement of Gnosticism is explicit. We saw that a couple videos ago. I can't remember the wifey's name, but she was talking about Gnosticism in the representation or equation of nature with the feminine. And of course, here in Freire, the Gnostic aspect is an explicit form of knowledge of the divine. So this is again where, even though he states it as completion of God's work, the subtlety is when you state God, if you're really Christian, then you probably be stating Christ more frequently. God, however, can be ambiguous, and we know that since the post-structuralist, there is a pragmatism in the language and a deconstruction of the language so that it is made immediate to the material world. So here, for example, God could just mean God in the material world, unless it's actually Christ explicit. Then you've got to start having Occam's razor and being able to slice between these things in order to understand what's going on. And the easy way of obviously slicing between these things and seeing what's going on is to see, okay, well, is it actually the Christian system or is it not? Here, of course, the Gnoseocratic system would be to, the way Freire says it, is to complete God's work. Now, God finished his creation and then he took a breather on Sunday. Sunday was the Sabbath, and we as humans under the old law had to obey the Sabbath because that's the way that God instructed us. The Sabbath was for us, otherwise we'd live as slaves. Now, coming to Freire's work, you have this notion of completing God's work. So that day that God rested, he should have actually been working. So it's for humanity as far as liberatory theology is concerned, particularly Paulo Freire's iteration of it, in which the collective humanity must develop the knowledge which will complete God's work. However, again, caveat, God does not necessarily mean Christ. God can mean, after anti-Christianity, the pantheist deity. Of course, this makes a lot of sense when you recognize that many subtleties in Freire's framework are explicitly anti-Christian. So Freire, like Marx, like Engels, like Gayatri Spivak, says that charity is one of those tools of domestication. Now, of course, charity is in the Christian system prior to awareness of the Pareto problem, but is the solution to the Pareto problem. So if you accrue immense degrees of wealth, the idea is that you must give it to those who obviously need it. Of course, the best thing to give to them would be the means to moderate their desires and the tools for them to be successful, in addition to the money that you might be giving them to solve their immediate needs. The whole teach a man to fish analogy by Christ. Also, the easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter into heaven. So you can see in all of these different systems, there's a bastardization, a dialectical manipulation of some of the principles which are often close to the ideas in Christianity, but are always on further examination, and the devil is in the detail, are revealed to be the inversion of Christianity. So that's why, for example, like I say, you have Marx and others say that charity is a form of amusement. So it's to maintain people in their oppressed situation. And of course, if you reject charity, then you come to the Marxist communist aspect, which is that you take property from people by force, but then you deem yourself moral and say that I'm doing so that I can give it to other people. Well, in the Christian system, there is no application of force. What is not freely given cannot be taken. In the Marxist system, force is used to take from people to distribute as is deemed necessary by the individual. I have deemed that you should have less stuff and that you should have more. And you're at the end of the barrel of the gun, so you don't have much choice. So when we look at Freire's system, we can recognize that there is this process of taking knowledge and developing it specifically to, and he's calling his system liberatory theology, or it's in the liberatory theology tradition, but it's clearly not Christian. It's oriented towards completing God's work. Now we can be skeptical of the definition of God. We know that he's not using Christian teaching. We know he's using a dialectical reformation of Christian teaching. And then, of course, we can now become incredibly suspicious that with the movement into utopia, what we actually have is the reinvigoration of the original pantheist system of Marx. And therefore, you're going to start to see a lot of environmentalism and things like this come in with systems that are associated with liberatory theology. The liberatory pedagogy would likewise help with that. So you will probably see environmentalism become the central, the linchpin of probably the most serious moral dilemmas in politics now in the 21st century. The other one alongside that will be transhumanism, which, as we have seen, is again at least from Haraway, is a rejection of God's law or creation, and that would be because ultimately, when you're a leftist, you reject any kind of moral gauge and things like these being set against you, to which you have to move. That's the whole idea in Christianity or whatever religion you have, like Buddhism. You've got the teachings of Buddha, and you are meant to have the right view of the world, which is the nature of suffering. You've got to have knowledge, but you have to have clarity. And so you can have erroneous knowledge, and you can have clarity, but not actually knowledge. Is it really the two? So you're trying to obtain all of these different skills and tools and different aspects to correctly apprehend things, and then to become the upright person. So you become Buddha, or you cultivate your Buddha nature in Buddhism, and then in Christianity you become Christ-like. So it's you moving towards Christ, whereas here you can see that it's everything moving towards the person. Lastly, of course, towards pantheism. So even though there's the social contract Rousseauist aspect, which breaks from the existing society, then after the post-structuralists you have neo-Rousseauism, so that's breaking from the language, the ideas and the concepts. Then at the very end you have the integration into the immediate, into the more materialist, and then you're moving off into your pantheist system. So the post-structuralism, as far as I'm concerned, is a cunning intermediate step, but ultimately towards the same end goal, because all you're doing is doing something which, through deconstruction and so on and so forth, is something extremely damaging, extremely destructive, rips things apart, but only kind of starts to posit things which are rooted in the material and are emotional and are collective. So it's still got some rules around it. And of course, yeah, I've said it already. Okay. So dialectical materialism, again, useful just to see this diagram every now and again. You've got the form of reason which needs to change, that's logic as it is today, or seeing distinctions between things, to having a break with this at the moment of consciousness raising, and then recognizing that all things are interlinked. Every object has moral valence and is either tainted by the old system and thought and being used by the old system of thought, or can be reformed by it. And you can kind of see that in the top diagram, which is this cone. It's meant to be this kind of vortex which is spiraling, on and on and on in history. It doesn't actually really end, but you've got, kind of prehistoricism. That is then reinterpreted through the historicist lens. You then move all the way through history towards a known goal. So in Marxist system, this would have been, or under Hegel, this would have been oriented towards the absolute. And so the idea is that philosophy informs the state. The state uses its power to, through education, raise people's consciousness into the culture in which they are united towards generating the absolute. You get the same essentially in Marx, but in a slightly different flavour. And here, of course, you've got the same in Freire, again, slightly different flavour because of the utopianism. And then, of course, I've appended the diagram of Foucault's system of, you've got your material relations reflected up into consciousness, but what's in consciousness is also a reflection of discourse. They are discourses, and biology or sex or law, these are different discursive areas, there are discursive relations around them. These are reflected in the way people behave, or the way people speak. And then, of course, institutions might have certain different contexts, like speaking about someone about medicine casually versus in a medical environment is going to have slightly different language, so on and so forth. So anyway, all of these different things are something which can be dialectically reformed towards utopia. So, for example, you've got your lived experience, which is going to be moving through this cone of history, and you are going to want to experience your having dialectically integrated everything around you into, the view of the world. However, at the same time, the collective has a handle on how you think. So there's this kind of hoovering up dimension in which you're trying to grab on and suck people into your system and berate and harm those who aren't. But at the same time, you are subject to the same cruelty if you step out of line. So there's this kind of shuffling towards the dialectical sphincter. So you've got, likewise, global citizenship. What is global citizenship? So there's an opening statement in this document, which is that guidance draws on research and practice in global citizenship education. Of course, research can easily refer to Freire's student-teacher dyad and their democratic process of gnosiologically developing knowledge, which is oriented towards the realization of utopia, which extends at the end of history, and of course the reformation of language, knowledge, and praxis and theory and solidarity in order to achieve that goal. Of course, research and practice together, research informs theory because it develops knowledge. So research, theory, and practice, praxis, of course. Then we've also got the association with discourses and so on and so forth. And then global citizenship education, education pedagogy, and global citizenship would, international citizen, communist. So you've got key figures in there like Vanessa Andreotti. She draws from people such as Gayatri Spivak, who's important because she translated Derrida's Of Grammatology into English. And then, in turn, Vanessa Andreotti draws significantly from Freire, and he, in turn, draws from Sartre. And so between Sartre and Derrida, we've got the post-structuralists and the very beginnings of post-structuralism. And it's very clear that they are integrated into the Marxist system or into the dialectical tradition, because Sartre is explicitly still trying to put forward dialectical materialism, but now through lived experience. So integrating the more of the Nietzschean aspects at the individual level into the dialectical movement and collective experience. And he also states whether, the new phase of the revolution needs to be philosophically grounded or whether it can be grounded in essentially a form of mythology and fantasy. And that's why you get the anti-truth and anti-factual aspect in the modern leftist politics. That comes from Sartre. And then it's Derrida and Foucault and people like that who really develop that thesis. They're very strongly tied into Sartre's critique of dialectical reason. Derrida, incidentally, says in Spectres of Marx that looking back on the dialectical tradition of Marx how can they not be the inheritors of it? It's this thing that they've got to be a part of, even though it murders millions of people. Okay, so ultimately, global citizenship, what is it? It is an alternative to national identity. And so the thing to recognize there is that it's an intersectional alternative. You can recognize that there's a lot of identity politics rooted around intersectional identities, things like sex, race, class, so on and so forth. Now, you have all of the traditional ways in which people have been conflicted with one another, which can be exploited to integrate people into different aspects of revolutionary movements, and so on and so forth. The alternative is that you create identities which are victimized or in conflict with others. So here the contention is to establish the thesis and antithesis opposed to one another as national citizenship versus global citizenship. And of course, the victimhood that's in global citizenship is trying to drag on all of the other types of victimhood which are in the other identity. So you're going to see things like colonialism is a feature of national identity, therefore anti-colonialism is a feature of global citizenship. The International Workers' Revolt was to do with global citizenship as well. People who are communist and apparently good, even though they want to use force to take things from people, and they stamp on anyone who shows any kind of resistance to them. They are the victims because they were fought against, and they've got the ideas which are going to save everyone from themselves and reality from humanity. And likewise, fundamentally, you've still got the communist aspect under it, so you're going to see eco-justice as a significant aspect, and one of the things that the global citizen will display is that, I'm a citizen of the world is persecuted by private property and capitalist industry, it's threatening to my life, therefore I must exert my ability to defend myself. So I am a victim of civilization. So there's an emphasis on interconnectedness, and you can see that in whether it's the Rousseauist or the whatever kind of dialectical iteration of the Rousseauist movement, which is the horizontal social contract now taking place, driven by the educational system. So you have academics generate the dialectical education system, or the content of the education, reform the way that education is performed, as well as the content of the education, thereby putting theories or altering the material conditions which the children come to the school in. This is reflected in their knowledge. Of course, that's a reflection of the material conditions and the social relations. They're then going to change the way that they speak about things. But you're always going to have to be dialectically reforming the knowledge. Otherwise, that knowledge will act as a barrier and maintain their praxis in this eddy in which their lived experience can't truly apprehend and move towards the utopian end goal of the global citizen interconnected pantheist movement. So you're going to have a lot of subject reflection, which we've discussed in other videos. That's where you've got to see the yourself reflected in the other, and they have to be dialecticians like yourself, so it's non-contradiction between you and the other, kind of like just kind of strange. And then solidarity as well is going to be an aspect of that interconnectedness, and democracy, you're going to hear a lot of that word, and democracy really is, it's that kind of Rousseauist form of democracy, the Marxist form of democracy. So global citizen refers to a sense of belonging to a broader community and common humanity. It emphasizes political, economic, social and cultural interdependency and interconnectedness between the local, the national and the global. So what you're doing is you're taking all of the different aspects in terms of how high up you can scale your collective identities, and then you're trying to get global citizenship to essentially exist above as a universal, and to try and render all the different national identities and all the different levels in which there are geographic entities or boundaries of law systems, which would be states, try to integrate all of these as particulars under the universal principle and universal identity of the global citizen. Of course, because this isn't naturally occurring, you're only going to get into this by the application of force, by forcibly taking these ideas, teaching them to people, and then basically trying to create the movement. So it's not an organic bottom-up movement. It's the top-down imposition through education to get people to see themselves as global citizens. Of course, if they knew the framework which was behind it and developing these ideas, then they would understand that the more they engage with them, the more they are engaging with ideas which are fundamentally rooted in a form of anti-humanism, which has likewise got a religious system of self-deification, which is associated with pantheism, and which in the past has murdered people in order to move past the negation of Christianity in order to constitute that pantheist species being. We will therefore not be surprised that the global citizen has their own moral system, which is called social justice. And social justice is, of course, very fitting once you have got established the Rousseauist aspect of the Marxist tradition, because it's that horizontal covenant, it's the spoken word of the collective assembled, which is the collective will of the body politic. So it's the justice which issues from their consciousness at the point in time. And of course, they're going to have certain morals which are oriented towards certain goals. If you've got the Freirean aspect underpinning this, then of course you've got the utopian. So you're going to have a strong environmental bent to it. And then we would expect to see a culture also oriented around those moral principles and the way that people have, conduct themselves, their observances in society, what's deemed beautiful, and so on and so forth. So if you can cast your mind back to when we looked at Aaron Gare's postmodernism and the environment, one of the key things that came out of the very end of his work was, okay, post-structuralism did its job, it smashed everything apart, but it didn't give us an integrating end point to which we all must orient ourselves. It's like, well, duh, that's the point of post-structuralism. But the point of post-structuralism is to do that in order that someone like Aaron Gare can then come along and go, oh, why aren't we all working together? And then what you do is you then orient towards a new goal, and the new goal, of course, which he parsed out was a kind of eco-nationalism. And of course, if you got an eco-nationalism, which is of the dialectical tradition, then you can look at things like neo-Hegelian systems like fascism to look at what might happen on a country level with their collectivism, but also in orientation in relation to their moral system, and then what kind of world they're trying to build, so what they're oriented towards. Okay, so girls and boys learn about gendered attitudes, roles, expectations, and behaviours at school as well as at home. Global citizenship education can support gender equality through the development of knowledge, skills, values, and attitudes that promote the equal value of women and men. Of course, part of the framework is to already posit that men and women are not equal. Of course, there are countries in which that's the case. There are religions and cultural patterns in which that is not the case. In which that is the case. But it's not just a fundamental ontological feature of reality in all places at all times. But by simply stating it and repeating it over and over and over again, you can say, women are oppressed, women are oppressed, women are oppressed. It becomes this chant, this mantra which is repeated, and then anything which is taken as an indicator or which is seen as feeding into that oppression of women then needs to be smashed and wiped out. Whether or not it was actually oppressing them or whether or not it actually existed. But nonetheless, this thing can just go forward. And of course, when you've got gender equality, you're no longer talking about equality between the sexes. You're now talking about queer theory and that entire system of Foucault and so on and so forth. So you've got the connection here right into post-structuralism. You've got the whole project to separate sex from law and sex from biology. That's how you get the whole gender thing come up. Then you can establish your own arbitrary genders in order to then have equality between the gender that you've arbitrarily established and the ones which actually are contingent on sex and reality. You then need to put laws in place which prioritize those new fantastical ones and which denigrate the other ones and ultimately move society towards that dialectical endpoint. So yeah, it's pretty straightforward once you know. Okay, so you've got the horizontal social contract, you've got all the government, the bureaucracy, the institutions and the business and things like that. These need to be already formed. You've then also got the different areas in which these are represented, and then how you as an individual are bolted into this whole process. So you can see here how, if you're really taking kind of a Foucauldian mindset and approaching things, there's a massive web of what they would say are discourses and power. And of course, with the Sartrean aspect, you've got your lived experience. Lived experiences, of course, can populate the knowledge which is in the contents of a Foucauldian discourse. So all of this fits together very nicely. And you, as an individual, can use this lived experience to reform the world around you in orientation towards this global citizen goal, and having your, contriving your own morals. So both Nietzsche and Marx come very nicely into that. Marx because he explicitly uses the inversion of Christianity, and Nietzsche also because he comes at the Antichrist from a slightly different perspective. So in both of them, you've got the complementary movement, which is anti-Christian. That's obviously why the two can be synthesized together so easily, and also why both of these feature together in a lines underpinning global citizenship. So there's a clue there for later on about what's going to happen with some of the religions, but we'll come back to that. Okay, so the global citizen identity, from Sartre, you see yourself as this node in the dialectical entity, and you're embedded within this ensemble, and you're all flowing towards this goal that's been realized in consciousness. So you've got 1 foot in reality as it is now, and then you've got 1 foot in history, but by that I mean 1 foot in the future, and what your future representation of the world is, and then the theory and actions that you need in order to realize that. So moving people in that goal-oriented action towards the ideas of the dialectical academics. And then you overcome anything which is inhibitory towards that, because that's labeled anti-praxis, so you need to destroy it. And then you overcome the interiorization of the oppressor. That's what leads to anti-praxis, and then you can move forward. And then from Freire, you've got the knowledge production, which is made collectively. You've obviously got the completion of God's work. I've reduced God here from capital G to lower g, and then italicized it, as I do for the concepts which are in the dialectical tradition, to represent that God word is now a very vague word. It's not Christ, it's the pantheism that's at the end. So it's completing the uncompleted world. It's the world which the species needs to labor upon. So the species must labor on being. Species being together, being the Eurobric entity, which takes from itself, by itself, for itself, and refashions the generated world and generated man. Of course, within that framework of process of generation, that man reforms himself, frees himself, and can create his own morals, and can become post-human if necessary, and so on and so forth. So you get the transhumanism come in there as well. So with Freire, you've got the Conscientization. I still can't pronounce that great. You overcome the domestication, dehumanization, which is simply stated. Again, you simply state the victimhood, and you point to things of the world like the natural suffering of the world, and you say, this is horribly evil, we must overcome it, blah, 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 blah. Enter into the dialectical drain. And then cultivate solidarity, and then you go through and you've got this new identity and this new self-knowledge which you can reorient yourself. So you go through a rebirth in terms of your identity and your understanding of the world, and then conduct yourself politically in accordance. The document itself shares that there's different aspects to the education, so you're trying to hit people the way they think. So that's the knowledge. Well, you can obviously read it yourself here, but the very way that people think, critical thinking. So critical should be understand. Remember, you got to have the pragmatism in place that one word can have multiple meanings, and that the Marxists and dialectical materialists have a parallel dictionary. So whenever you're seeing a key word like critical, remember that's not just, you got critical thinking in terms of taking data for and against an argument, really hashing out the validity and the strength and the evidence of them, and then trying to come to an actual reasoned conclusion which is coherent with the information at hand. Here, critical thinking is critical in the sense of destroying, and that kind of, or dialectically reforming. We know that because it cites Freire and his system. So easy peasy. Interdependency, of course, this is trying to facilitate the international relationships, But the thing that's never really thought of in this interconnectedness is, okay, let me put something to you just now, which is if you have the entire world under one nation, what happens if a figure like Stalin or Mao or Hitler comes to power? That's the problem with their single world state fantasy, which is in the event that someone like that comes to power, the death toll would make the 20th century, which is the worst century in human history so far, in terms of tens of millions exterminated mindlessly and for stupid reasons of people trying to replace religion with some sort of earthly political religion, that can be magnified right to the peak of wiping out humanity, given the tools and the technologies we have now. That's the problem that they really don't apprehend. Anyway, you've got the social emotional aspect. So this is really looking to undermine the aspects of your identity which you maintain as distinct from others. So you're trying to overcome, remember there's that thing called reflection, you wanting to build that reflection in the collective. So you need to overcome people's individuality. So you need to break down the things that they're identified with, which are individualistic, which are national, and so on and so forth, and the unique aspects of their culture and their value systems, what their artwork, their mannerisms, and so on and so forth. And so you've got this great convergence which needs to take place, and then you need to have the emotional disdain for the past, and then the blind, the pathos, the naive movement into this convergence, and that it's going to solve all of the problems. But of course, you know, with the Gnostic inversion of reality, which is waiting at the end of it, it's actually going to not be utopia, it's going to be this ruthless, bitter, oppressive, environmentalist hellhole, where any kind of development forward is seen as some sort of anti-human abomination which needs to be smashed out, and anyone who doesn't conform absolutely to the preservation of sacred Gaia from rapacious humanity need to be extirpated. And of course, if you go back to the nature deities, then you ultimately risk human sacrifice again, but we've already done that through Marx and Mao, and even Stalin, and even Hitler. You know, Hitler's Aryans. You're meant to try and purify the blood out of the German people to then and other people to create the Aryan race, who will then inherit the earth, and the others, you know, they are ruled over as slaves. So ultimately, Hitler's system is anti-Germanic because it's pro-Aryan. It's a subtlety, but you know, once you start to look at how the transhumanists, directed evolutionists, and things like this think, then these issues are brought into quite abrupt resolution. Then, of course, in the global system identity side, you've also got the behavioural. So again, you've got theory, consciousness represented in different institutions, the way you think, the things that are communicated, whether you are the person who's got the greatest victimhood aspect, which means that you should then be put in the center in order to spread your word and your lived experience, and then everyone has to integrate that, change the way they behave, and clap and all this. Oh, you are so oppressed, we must, you know, give you whatever it is. Global citizenship education aims to be transformative, building the knowledge, skills, and values and attitudes that learners need to be able to contribute to a more inclusive, just, and peaceful world. It's always those last couple of words that really tickle my berries, because this more inclusive thing is just a load of garbage. But the real crux behind it is that, you know, it's inclusive in the sense that you're part of the Rousseauist or neo-Rousseauist collective, but once you're in, you're damn well in. You know, you're under the thumb. The collective's got its hand on you, and you best not be exhibiting any kind of heretical thinking which, you know, apprehends reality, or which actually has a moral system associated with it. How dare you? You know, you can't have any of that. Just, I mean, it kind of makes me spit feathers when I see a dialectical materialist using the word just. All that will mean is to move people towards the known end that they have contrived, and to do so by any means necessary. And then peaceful, I mean, okay, well, you know, you can start to ask, when's it going to be peaceful? I mean, when it comes to the revolutionaries, it's only peaceful after they've done doing their thing. But they're revolutionaries, so it's never peaceful. It's the promise of peace, but it's the you can't murder your way into peace. So global citizenship education takes a multifaceted approach, employing concepts and methodologies already applied in other areas, including human rights education, peace education, education for sustainable development, and education for international understanding, and aims to advance their common objectives. So all of these different forms of education are developed in such a way that they have common objectives with one another. So they're all basically adjacent to one another in helping to lead people into a certain system. I'll add as a caveat, when I was talking about that previous part, about the peace and things like that, it's in the Marxist system that you're obviously never going to have the peaceful world. They don't realize it. It doesn't necessarily mean that every utterance in this global citizenship document is dialectical materialist, but given the fact that it references so many dialectical materialists, I really struggle to discount that as what that's really oriented towards. Okay, so global citizenship education applies a lifelong learning perspective, beginning from early childhood and continuing through all levels of education into adulthood, requiring both formal and informal approaches, curricular and extracurricular interventions, and conventional and unconventional pathways to participation. So again, every aspect of reality which may need to be dialectically reformed in order to get people to get to the predetermined goal is a card on the table, is a tool to be used by hook or by crook. No wonder unconventional pathways to participation might be necessary. So the global citizenship education aims to enable learners to, so they get their understanding, and it's primarily politics and power. Straight off the bat, politics and power, that's where they need to get. So you need to cultivate people's, and bear in mind, these are, kids, people out of school, people who really know nothing, no experience of the world, haven't really kind of had some real meaty failures under their belt and learned something about the world, and then, got to a better place of understanding the world how it is, and then being able to adapt and exhibit successes and overcome problems. It's the naive that are taken advantage of and who are being taught, well, this is what you need to do in order to get power. And the problem is, like, the people who are hanging around and not aware of this stuff, by the time they're even getting their boots on, these people have got, petitions, laws down the throat, and they'll be well ahead, really well ahead, and it's going to be tough. I'm increasingly convinced that it will be, we're already in authoritarianism, and it may even be through the totalitarianism that we need to go. I'm not sure if we're at the point of being able to circumvent it at this point. Okay, so you recognize and appreciate differences and multiple identities again. So that's the blind acceptance, which on a certain level, in terms of overcoming racism and things like that, and some of those kind of crude ways of just trying to discount other people and be cruel to other people. I agree with that, but here, if you are using the dialectical methodology, you're not trying to actually get rid of racism. You're trying to use victimhood to reestablish racism in a different direction. But now you're going to try and, within different cultures and communities, you're going to have this global citizen contingent which are warring against their own people. But it all looks like it's ground up democratic movement from within the nation. So, it's difficult for people to recognize the sedition and the treason which is being taught. And then, of course, you got civic literacy, so just looking at things and reading it in the right way, identifying the oppression, and then making the critical inquiry and the changes needed to dialectically reform it. And they're actually engineering people to look at people's beliefs and values, and then to obviously see how they pre-predict, to get them to strategize over every aspect of how they can reform society in order to manipulate the levers of power in global governance structures. And then, of course, you do all this with the rubric of some sort of attitude of care and empathy. So, every exertion of power that you make, every strive for domination, and step forward for, exerting domination is all done under the, oh, look how much I care, look how much I'm empathetic towards other people. But never does it say, okay, well, step back and, really kind of assess things. look at where your intellectual tradition comes from, look at its fruits, and then look at where you are likely to, the kinds of things that you are likely to plant and grow in turn. The tree will be known by its fruits, or whatever the saying is, and here it's precisely the same. And then, of course, there are developing values of fairness and social justice. So, of course, fairness in relation to social justice, that's fairness by what the collective deems fair. So what's the democratic knowledge Reformation informed is the right amount of material that you should or should not have. Remember that charity is a form of domestication which makes you and the people who are receiving it a kind of animal. So you need to overcome charity. Of course, you're only really going to get fairness without charity by force. And then, of course, the skills to critically analyze the inequalities based on gender, socioeconomic, blah, 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 blah. Rattle off the long list of people who need to have some sort of force applied and then stuff given to them, whether it's rights or property. And then, of course, participating in contemporary global issues at all different levels. Just all the usual. Now, of course, one of the things that I got to thoroughly enjoy whilst I was writing my book was that I had a lot of time to go through the citations which are actually quoted in the Global Citizenship document itself, published by UNESCO. And so UNESCO have explicitly cited Vanessa Andreotti. Vanessa Andreotti draws from Paulo Freire. Freire, of course, we know is a Gnostic materialist oriented towards utopia and has developed an education system in order to try and facilitate that. Likewise, Vanessa Andreotti, influenced by Gayatri Spivak, and cites Gayatri Spivak in a number of works. She's important because she's against human rights, at least in their present form. She describes herself as a feminist deconstructionist type, and she translated Derrida's Of Gravitology into English. So, this is the tradition that we're drawing from. Now, parallel to that, we've got someone called Idu, and there's a bunch of others in the paper as well. And they state that there's a necessary aspect that's in global citizenship which requires understanding the relationship between ecological and cultural systems, specifically between the domination of nature and oppressed groups. So the key thing there is that you're seeing that the people's orientation, or people's material relations, I should say, and the social relations associated therewith are reflected up into consciousness and have certain cultural institutions and practices and things that are aesthetic to them relative to that culture. This in turn is linked and informed by the domination of nature, but is in turn linked to oppressed groups. And so the idea here is to use oppressed groups in relation to the domination of nature to collect those two together and to establish essentially environmental movements between the in those oppressed groups, and then to use this to overthrow the existing cultural system, which is stated as being informed by the oppressors and which maintains the domination of nature. So this is why you can see this in brackets. It's essentially a reference to, the work by Caroline Merchant. She was one of the key founders of ecofeminism, so it's going to go right back there. Addressing environmental racism, including the geographical dimension of social injustice, environmental pollution. So again, this is trying to reinvigorate the being able to use the kind of criticism of racism or colonialism against people in countries who use goods which may or may not affect the environment, but now couching it as racism. So if you harm the environment, you might be being racist because now the oppressed groups have been linked to the domination of nature. So you can see that it depends on what goal you want. If you want to be able to call people racist, you need to get the certain things or get all the dialectical ducks in a row in order to, how can I call this person a racist? You're creating plastic bottles is making oppression for people in the Maldives, or whatever it happens to be, something along that lines. And then there's people in the Maldives who've got, some of their people have moved to the West, and so those people must also be environmentally oppressed on some level, and then look at their health outcomes because blah, blah, and it all just goes on and on. Okay, so revitalizing the non-commodified traditions of different ethno-racial groups and communities. Okay, well, non-commodified traditions of different ethno-racial groups, that would cast my mind back to, based on all the things I've read, a form of animism in more primitive societies. That's what that means. And then, okay, obviously it's got example religious worldviews there, for example. So yes, human-earth relationships as sacred. That's the pantheism. Remember, pantheism is the thing which is the goal, and it needs to destroy Christ through anti-Christianity to get to that. If you happen to be in Islam, it would be destroying the current understanding of Islam in order to get to the pantheism. If it was Buddhism and so on and so forth, all the same processes. So the interesting thing about this paper, and the reason why I highlighted it, is because it's making the or it's outlining the necessity to get dialecticians into different religious movements to dialectically reform the contents of the religion so that the religion is made more worldly, so the religion moves towards dialectical materialism, and then once it's integrated into the dialectical materialist methodology and concepts, all of these different world religions can then have this kind of, look at this thing which is in common between all of them. There's this maybe core underlying religion which happens to be Gnostic, and which is all happen to be oriented towards our union with Mother Nature. So again, we crash down into pantheism and all of the dangers of pantheism, which fundamentally is the story of Cain when he takes Abel to the field, when the sacrifices in the Old Covenant were to be vertical towards God, whereas Cain sacrifices horizontally to the earth, to himself. Okay, so ethno-racial groups and communities. Yeah, community can just mean, obviously, Marxists, dialectical materialists, pantheists. Reconceiving and adapting our lifestyles in ways that will not jeopardize the environment for future generations. So again, anything which is seen to be harmful to the environment is stamped upon. Ultimately, that can be the kind of the Rousseauist movement now. You could really get a strong Rousseauist aspect, which is to return to small communities and, low levels of technology or something, but it would need to be imposed top down. And the only way I can seriously think about having that maintained is that you have technology maintained and then consolidated in the hands of a few powerful individuals, which then use it to manage society. Or perhaps even nowadays with AI, you write a program in an AI and it goes and fulfills its program requirements, and the program just runs itself, and the totalitarianism just runs itself. So recognizing past and present instances of eco-imperialism, so again, that's the kind of, you're a big racist because you're using plastic bottles, to describe the ways in which the environments of colonized societies have been physically transformed by the experience of colonial occupation. Okay, so again, you can only see things that are never going to deny that colonialism was a barbarity, but of course, you need to then say, at least through this system, because this thing happened in the past, you are associated with your group, and therefore your group is in debt. Justice needs to be administered to you socially. So there's, it's a very old form of eye for an eye, but which isn't restricted to the boundaries of the individuals concerned in those events. So under this system, you can never actually have peace because no people can reconcile correctly, because they're only ever avatars for all of the strife between different peoples which happen prior to them, which they were neither there for to experience and suffer, or were neither there to enact on others. So you're in this bind where it's just there can be no justice under dialectical materialism. Foregrounding critical pedagogies of place. So that's a critical pedagogy. So you teach people to become critical adherents to the revolutionary movement. That can be place as in physical location like country, but it could also be places in terms of, the dominant network of concepts that are in consciousness in terms of an epistemological place which influences your consciousness and which may prevent you from looking through the kaleidoscope, as the thing's called. Attuned to the particularities of where people actually live, including the importance of naming historical and contemporary instances of violence, occupation, blah, 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 blah. So yeah, find the victimhood. Call things that even aren't violence, because what that lets you to do is scream and wail and beat your chest and cry and all this snivelling stuff, and use that as an excuse to then have, this thing that I dislike cannot be manifested in society. But what the victimhood is used is to then manifest real force. Real force and persecution comes through victimhood. So, for example, recognize that in Marx's system, the proletariat, and I understand the fact that they are just indulging in their own murderous tendencies and desires, but they fundamentally do it through victimhood, and then through the supposed vicarious goal of divesting all individuals of property to then invest the species with all of that property. All of this victimhood and stuff like that is just a pathetic means to exert force against others. It's precisely the same thing which so it's already for example extensively developed in dialectical materialism under Marx. That's the whole framework of labor and fetishism. Don't need to go over that again. But it's even the case in Hitler. So Hitler's doctrine of the Aryan is that there's been this degradation of the quality of blood which needs to be reconcentrated, but then fundamentally the force that's standing in the way of that is international Jewry. So ultimately what you see is that both Germans and Aryans are victims of this monetary system which is dominating people and exploiting people. And then likewise, as far as he sees it, communism's a threat, so he wants to do it on a national level. But both of them proceeded through victimhood. So, victimhood is not something which in and of itself should be seen as a positive. It's quite clearly one of the pathways to the most murderous systems that we've ever seen. Next, we have a focus on religion in GC would entail comparative and historical explanations of the way in which the world's religions are transforming and transformed by social, cultural, political, ecological, economic dynamics of globalization, as well as interrelated tensions of modernization, secularization, decolonization. Okay, big mouthful there. What's happening is that religion now needs to become an explicit thing which is dialectically reformed. You can find that whether it's in Bruno Latour, or people who are studying cultural studies and animism and things like this. You see all of these ideas come up, and the task really is to understand the religion in its context, and to then, like we saw with Canguilhem, use the milieu to influence here, not the organism, but at least in terms, an organization or an institution or an epistemological framework, a metaphysical system. And it's abundantly clear that through this process of mapping out the dialectical relations, obviously having dialectical materialists move into those religious systems to establish materialist conceptions, to then teach those, to teach also the dialectical methodology, or at least to get people on board with the constant transformation of their theological system into something else. Through that process, you get people bedded in to the dialectical materialism, and then you can see how the social, culture, political thing, all these slight different subtleties of a religion in different areas, you try and use this to invalidate the universality of that religion because of the particularities, and then likewise, you then put all of these little religions as particulars, and that there's some sort of universal religion ahead of them, which ultimately is going to be dialectical materialism, pantheism. Okay, and then likewise, you've got the economic dynamics of how becoming a global world has changed all of these things, and, all these, basically you just pick your thing and do your thing with it to get towards the goal, to get towards the revolution. And then the exploration of religion in global citizenship education would entail examinations of multiple intersections of religion and globalization through a variety of global issues, including human rights development, environmental sustainability, pluralism, and poverty. So you resituate the religions to be around these different conceptual boundaries and what they say around that, and then you start to teach those as the political doctrine instead. Of course, that would then mean that academics and dialectical materialists in the different religions working together can have common framework, and you can begin this synthesis of breaking down the distinctions between the different religious systems, their metaphysics, and to try and then establish this new one, which is more coherent with one another, but which is in relation to global citizenship. So the key takeaway out of this is that global citizenship will be an explicitly religious movement. It will be manifested through religious institutions with discourses and social justice oriented around the relation of the individual to the international community, and with the international community to the environment. International community to the environment, species, being. Yet another paper. In the Earth's Care Global Justice Framework for Ecological Justice, we emphasize the need to reframe the environment as a set of living, human and other than human beings, rather than a set of resources to be extracted, exploited to the sense, and to treat the Earth itself as an entity rather than as property to be owned. So, of course, here we can see more of the pantheist kind of aspect. You know, the Earth is a living being. Of course, we can have relations with animals other than human beings. Animals or the actual world itself. Of course, you've got to be very careful of that, because that's species being, and species being, pantheists see the world as an extension of themselves. So you extracting resources, owning private property, doing something which harms the environment is something which is killing them. It will always be the framework of violence, which things are realized by. You know, everything that the opposition do is seen as violence. Therefore, it gives complete delimitation to all of the actions required to stamp on the people who are accused of that violence by the people who've adopted the victimhood identity, because they see themselves in pantheist union with the world around them. Now, this is attached to a form of cognitive justice, apparently. So for cognitive justice, we emphasize the need to interrupt a monoculture of thought based on a single rationality, recognize the possibilities and limitations of all knowledge systems, and enact intellectual accountability in order to understand and connect all the dots between the different structures of knowing and being that keep our existing harmful ecological and economic systems in place. So, again, just like we've seen, the form of your cognition needs to be regulated, and there's a requirement to have people know in their minds that the tasks they need to do are to think and act and speak in a certain way which disrupts the existing culture. You could call it a cultural hegemony, of course, from the Gramscian perspective. You break apart the prevailing forms of rationality and thought and knowledge. The limitations, of course, the limit situations in Freire that are boundaries towards utopia. And you need to get people intellectually accountable. So they are now accountable for having the wrong ideas and thinking wrong. You've got wrong think. Of course, we know this already through all of the trans phenomena and things. But again, this is now wrong think in relation to the environment. And of course, you are punishable, because ultimately you will be harming people, you'll be doing violence, you'll be exterminating the human race if you don't go along with their politics. And of course, once the destruction of all of humanity is the thing which you're up against, then this delimits, it's the ultimate victimhood, it delimits all power and allows any and all things to be done in order to protect the environment, to protect Gaia from man. Okay, and it's obviously man, because it's man that's seen as the fundamental evil entity, of course, in this, because man is inherently oppressive because of everything we've seen with Engels and the family and so on and so forth. Okay, so you've got the cognitive justice in the mind, and then you've got the emotional justice. That's the religion of pathos aspect. For effective justice, we emphasize the need to work through the unevenly distributed traumas, fragilities and fears that have been generated within the existing system, and to learn to be comfortable with difficulty, complexity, uncertainty, complicity, blah, 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 disillusionment, and the work of transformation. Okay, so again, you tap into the victimhood identity, and then you bring all of the suffering up. You've got to keep on talking about it, and then you use all of these to drive forward the transformation, the dialectical change. And then for relational justice, so this is in the relationship to other people. For relational justice, we emphasize the need to develop reciprocal rather than extractive or consumptive relations between oneself and the earth itself, other humans, as well as other than human beings, including both present and future generations of all species. So other than human beings, I could probably put a little interesting seed idea into that. Is that can be humans, that can be animals, it can be transhumans, so post-humans if you're in the rest of the framework. That's being provided for here in global citizenship education. And of course, it would make a lot of sense that if you're going through a lot of the technological developments, you've got the ecofeminism, you've got the Murray Bookchin anarchism, technology needs to be integrated into it. The organization of economy needs to be governed by environmental principles, qua Barry Commoner and Aaron Gare. All of these things can come together. It makes a lot of sense to have some guy come along with a brain chip that can go into everyone's mind, that can, instead of just reading signals from your brain, or it can put signals back into your brain to try and get you to try and harmonize the firing of neurons in your brain and the emotions associated therewith to something that was being fired in someone else's brain, or that you're being programmed to experience. So something like that would help the emotional convergence of a transhumanist species community. And then finally, for economic justice, we emphasize the possibility of enacting modes of coordination and collaboration that support metabolic well-being in ways that exceed traditional debates about the distribution of resources, which even in their critical form tend to objectify and commodify the lives and labor of both humans and other than human beings. Again, this just means that, well, metabolic is the process of consuming. So in Engels, it was kind of pretty straightforward, because it's the taking of unconscious substance or inorganic nature. You ingest the material, you eat it, it becomes part of your body, and then you obviously excrete it back to the world. So you've got this metabolism. And then from Marx's criticism of capitalism and private property, the metabolism under the private property framework is ultimately it's rapacious, it strips the world of everything, and then all that's left behind is deserts. That was written in one of Marx's letters. So you've got a false metabolism which destroys the world, versus the dialectical materialism metabolism, which is supposed to promote well-being, but of course they don't realize that they're open up to murder in order to ends justify the means. So the thinking's askew. And I believe that is everything. To recap, in part one, we looked through Freire's methodology. So this was the collapse of distinctions, now rendered through education, which is looking at more of a cultural project a la Gramsci and Mao, and using democratic processes to just create knowledge out of the material objects and observances around them, and then to integrate into that the notion of domestication and how all of these things domesticate you. You've come to awareness of this. Now you need to dialectically reform everything, and you know that utopia is possible, then you should be oriented towards it. This is the stuff that Global Citizenship document by the UNESCO cites explicitly. And then global citizen identity, it's quite clear that obviously underpinned by so many dialectical thinkers and dialectical methodology and all of the things that we've seen, it's a dialectical identity. It's trying to make use of a different form of reason. It's got aspects that feed into lived experience in terms of relation with the world. It's got its new morality, which of course is going to be essentially antagonistic to every kind of form of morality and culture and everything which that it exists in, because the identity fundamentally is antagonistic to nation states, individualism, private property, the old religions, and it's going to try and overcome all of these, but to try and do so after the violent revolutions of the 20th century, in a way in which it doesn't come forward as visibly violent and oppressive and cruel, because of course, you know, that's one of the key tools among the Marxists and dialectical materialist types, is to always claim victimhood, but not necessarily seeing, you know, so much open violence. It's going to be a bit more subtle this time, try and get people to buy into it and to see the evil as the good. And so here it's very subtle, and it's trying to get people on board into their own destruction. And then you've, of course, you know, you're going to use more kind of primitive forms of morality or Rousseauian horizontal forms of social justice and collective will. And of course, then there's also all of the issues that come with that. And then with the rejection of reason, because it's a religion of pathos oriented towards negating Christ, and in order to obtain the pantheist deity of which you are a part, and which anyone who resists you is an enemy which can be sacrificed in order to help bring about that pantheist deity. Well, we know that it's going to be a complete mess in the end. And of course, with the threat of extinction of the world and humanity, then the license is completely open as to what can be done. These are the works cited. Hope you enjoy the video.